January 1952, Harlem's most feared room belonged to the Italians, until Bumpy Johnson walked in alone, stared down 5 armed men, and forced a deadly silence from Vito Genovese himself. The city's mafia bosses thought they would finally claim the Black Enclave, making $1 million a day. Instead, in just 6 minutes, Harlem's fate changed. Why did Genovese hesitate to pull the trigger? And what invisible power did Johnson wield that left even New York's commission unwilling to cross a single line north of 110th Street? The real battle for Harlem's survival was always about more than muscle. The numbers racket powered Harlem's independence, running like clockwork through every block north of 110th Street. Each morning, ward collectors fanned out across the neighborhood, gathering bets scribbled on slips of paper. Shopkeepers, barbers, even school children played their favorite numbers, hoping for a windfall. The real prize, though, belonged to the bankers behind the scenes. By the late 1940s, Harlem's policy game was generating close to $1 million a day. Untaxed, unregulated, and out of reach of City Hall or the 5 families. Stephanie St. Clair, known as Queenie, had built the foundation. She organized the first truly black-controlled lottery in New York, creating a labyrinth of collectors, runners, and trusted lieutenants. Profits did not just vanish into offshore accounts, they circled back into the community. Rent for families behind on payments, legal fees for the accused, donations to churches and schools. The numbers racket was more than crime. It was Harlem's insurance policy against the outside world. Bumpy Johnson learned the business at St. Clair's side. He studied the math, the psychology, and the politics. Every ward had its own collectors, each responsible for a stretch of blocks. A collector might bring in $2,000 a day, passing it up a chain that ended in a discreet office above a pool hall or restaurant. Runners moved quietly, blending in with the crowd, eyes always open for plainclothes detectives or unfamiliar faces. If the police raided one spot, the operation shifted 2 streets over by sundown. But the real genius lay in the redistribution model. Unlike the Italian mob's top-down structure, Harlem's policy bankers kept the money circulating locally. Ward bosses handed out loans, paid off police, and quietly supported civil rights causes. This system built loyalty that could not be bought or threatened away. When Dutch Schultz tried to muscle in during the 1930s, St. Clair's network warned residents block by block. By the time the 5 families renewed their push after World War II, policy bankers had turned every corner store and beauty parlor into a listening post. For Genovese and the Commission, the numbers racket was unfinished business. They saw the profit, but not the web of relationships holding it together. On paper, $1 million a day looked like easy money. In reality, every dollar passed through hands that owed their livelihoods to Bumpy Johnson's protection. Harlem's economic engine ran on trust, quick math, and the unspoken rule that outsiders would never fully understand. That's why the room could go from laughter to silence in an instant. Because the real power in Harlem did not come from guns. It came from the numbers. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson arrived in Harlem with nothing but a suitcase and a reputation for quick thinking. By the early 1930s, he was already making himself useful to Stephanie St. Clair, the woman everyone called Queenie. She ran her operation from a cramped office above a bakery on 138th Street, surrounded by ledgers, betting slips, and a small army of trusted runners. St. Clair had survived shootouts with Dutch Schultz's men and outfoxed crooked cops. But she saw something different in Bumpy, a mind as sharp as her own, and a willingness to stand his ground when others ran. Under St. Clair's watchful eye, Bumpy learned the business from the inside out. He memorized the names of every collector on Lenox Avenue, studied the way odds were set, and kept track of every payoff to police or politician. He was more than muscle. He was a student of the game. When Schultz's enforcers tried to muscle in, Bumpy organized the defense. Harlem's streets turned into a chessboard, with each block a potential trap for outsiders. He recruited war veterans, local boxers, and men with nothing left to lose, arming them with pistols and information. Schultz's crew underestimated the loyalty St. Clair inspired. They expected fear and got resistance instead. The war for Harlem's numbers racket left more than 40 men dead, but St. Clair and Bumpy held their ground. When bullets failed, Schultz turned to bribes, but Bumpy's network proved harder to crack than any safe. He moved quietly, never flashing wealth, always listening for rumors of betrayal. By the time Lucky Luciano ordered Schultz's murder in 1935, Bumpy had already become the woman's right hand. The deal with Luciano that followed was simple but historic. Harlem would run its own numbers, pay a cut to the Italians, and keep the streets peaceful. For the first time, a black man sat across the table from the mafia as an equal, not a subordinate. It was around this time the nickname started to stick. They called him the fixed point, the anchor in a storm, the man who never blinked. When the police raided policy houses, Bumpy was the one who arranged bail before the squad car reached the station. When shopkeepers fell behind on rent, he sent envelopes, no questions asked. People in Harlem learned that if trouble came, Bumpy Johnson would stand between them and the wolves. His legend grew not from violence alone, but from the sense that Harlem finally had someone who couldn't be bought, bullied, or turned. By the late 1940s, with St. Clair stepping into the background, Bumpy's reputation was sealed. He became the man everyone called when a family member disappeared, when a rival threatened a business, or when the numbers runners needed protection from both the mob and the law. He didn't rule with fear. He ruled with the certainty that he would not move, no matter how hard the push. In a world where alliances shifted with the wind, Bumpy Johnson was the fixed point on which Harlem's safety and its pride rested. Summer 1947 brought the first real test from the outside. Word spread fast that Genovese's men were coming up from East Harlem, looking to take over the numbers houses by force. They arrived in shiny Buicks, doors swinging open, pistols at their sides, expecting the same fear they saw in other neighborhoods. But as soon as they crossed 110th Street, nothing went according to plan. The streets looked quiet, but every corner had eyes. Johnson's scouts, mostly teenagers and old men, watched from stoops and barbershops. In the span of an hour, a message could travel from Lenox Avenue to Sugar Hill. Outsiders spotted, heads up. Runners ducked out of back doors. Policy slips vanished, and cash got moved to basements or behind church altars. By the time Genovese's soldiers hit a spot, it was empty. They would find a locked door, maybe a broom closet, never the haul they were after. On one block, a lookout posing as a shoeshine boy tapped out a warning on the curb with his brush. That was the signal for a runner inside to pull the fire alarm, clearing the building before the mobsters even reached the lobby. In another case, a local grocer handed a loaf of bread to a man on the corner. A simple gesture, but it told the next collector down the line to change the drop point. These weren't just lucky breaks. Bumpy had spent years building a network where every block captain, every fruit vendor, every kid with a bicycle played a part. The Italians tried intimidation, but Harlem answered with silence and empty rooms. Only 2 shootings were reported that summer, both outside policy spots. No one talked to the police, and no one talked to the mob. By the end of the week, Genovese's crew left with nothing but frustration and a growing sense that Harlem was different. Brute force, so effective elsewhere, collapsed in the face of a neighborhood that moved as one. The lesson was clear. You couldn't muscle Harlem if Harlem didn't want to be muscled. By 1952, Genovese had learned that Harlem couldn't be conquered by muscle alone. The next move came in envelopes, thick with cash, delivered to the men closest to Bumpy Johnson. One by one, trusted lieutenants found themselves offered more money than most would see in a lifetime. $50,000, sometimes $100, slid across a restaurant table or pressed into a palm after midnight. The message was simple: switch sides, give up routes, or feed information about the numbers operation. The 5 families had always relied on bribes to turn neighborhoods, and in most parts of the city, it worked. But Harlem's loyalty was different. For every man who took the money, 2 others reported the approach straight to Bumpy. The cash didn't just buy silence, it bought suspicion. Still, not every offer was refused. In 1952, one of Bumpy's own, a lieutenant responsible for collecting from Lenox Avenue, began leaking drop-off times to Genovese's men. The losses were immediate. Runners robbed, policy slips seized, and a week's worth of bets gone. Bumpy responded without warning. The compromised lieutenant disappeared, and the message traveled faster than any bribe. Betrayal came with a price higher than any envelope could cover. Genovese, seeing his cash offers bounce back, shifted tactics again. By 1958, the pressure turned psychological. Rumors spread that Bumpy's inner circle was riddled with informants. Anonymous tips reached the police, and false leads were planted to test loyalties. One winter night, a shipment of cash vanished after a tip-off that turned out to be a setup, engineered by Genovese's crew, but foiled when Bumpy's men anticipated the double cross. Each failed attempt left the Italians more frustrated and Harlem more guarded. Trust became a rare commodity. The old rules no longer applied. Every handshake was measured. Every conversation weighed. Inside the numbers racket, the sense of siege grew. Genovese's campaign of bribery and betrayal had failed to break Harlem's defenses, but it had sown just enough doubt to make negotiation seem like the only way forward. The first invitation arrived in 1949, tucked into a message from a trusted intermediary who usually handled nothing more dangerous than a numbers slip. This time, the wording was careful. No threats, no demands, just a suggestion that Bumpy Johnson meet with Genovese's people to discuss peace. It wasn't the first time the Italians had called for a sit-down, but the tone had changed. Genovese, fresh from his return to New York and eager to prove himself after Luciano's exile, wanted Harlem quiet and profitable. Bumpy read between the lines. He knew Genovese's recent failures. Muscle had failed, bribes had backfired, and the commission was growing impatient. The invitation wasn't about compromise. It was bait wrapped in silk. Johnson weighed his options. Bringing muscle would signal fear. Going alone would show confidence, but also expose him. He decided on the latter, but not without insurance. In the weeks before the meeting, he put his own form of a dead man's switch into place. He leaned on Illinois Gordon, the man who ran intelligence for Harlem's numbers operation. Gordon's job was simple. If anything happened to Bumpy, a series of files would be released. IRS documents tying Genovese to tax fraud, union bosses ready to testify about mob kickbacks, and a list of bribery payments, all prepared through favors from sympathetic prosecutors. Samuel Liowitz, an accountant with a long memory and a short fuse, was tasked with holding the actual files. Each piece of leverage was set to trigger if Johnson didn't walk out of the meeting. Union contacts stood by to tip off law enforcement about Genovese's gambling operations. The Gambino family, rivals of Genovese, had been quietly alerted that a power vacuum in Harlem could be their opportunity. Even the date February 14th was chosen for a reason. It was a deadline. If Johnson disappeared or turned up dead by then, the entire switch would go live. The message was clear, even if it was never spoken aloud. Genovese could kill Bumpy Johnson, but he'd risk burning down his own empire in the process. Bumpy Johnson stepped into the back room, the air thick with cigar smoke and the scent of sweat. 5 men waited, all armed, their eyes tracking him as he crossed the floor. Vito Genovese leaned back in his chair, a loaded .38 revolver resting in his hand, the muzzle pointed inches from Bumpy's temple. The room erupted in laughter, taunts in Italian, jokes about Southern boys out of their depth. Bumpy didn't flinch. He set his hat on the table, met Genovese's stare, and spoke in a voice steady enough to cut through the noise. "You have 10 seconds to put that gun down." The laughter faltered. Genovese's finger tightened on the trigger, searching for a hint of fear. Instead, Bumpy's eyes stayed fixed, his posture unshaken. Behind the threat, there was a silent promise, one Genovese's men didn't understand yet. A single glance passed between Bumpy and the nearest soldier, quick as a signal. The clock ticked. 6 minutes stretched out, every second louder than the last. The mockery faded. No one moved. The only sound was the low, measured breathing of 2 men who knew that, in this room, a single mistake could cost everything. The door never quite closed after that night. Harlem's independence held, but it came at a price. The terms of the truce were never written down, yet everyone understood them. Genovese would keep his distance, and Bumpy Johnson would limit the reach of his operation. Any expansion risked drawing the full weight of the commission, so profits stayed steady and territory lines stayed fixed. Whispers traveled fast through mafia circles. Genovese had lost face in front of his own men, and some bosses quietly questioned his judgment. The commission's minutes from 1953 mention Harlem only as a special arrangement, a problem to be tolerated rather than solved. The uneasy calm stretched on, but the threat never faded. Johnson slept lightly, knowing that every alliance could shift, every handshake might hide a knife. The cost of vigilance was measured in sleepless nights and trusted men who sometimes vanished without a trace. In 1957, when the Appalachian meeting scattered mafia bosses and brought law enforcement scrutiny, Harlem's peculiar autonomy survived untouched. The deal held because breaking it would have meant war on too many fronts, against the law, against the commission, and against a community that had learned to defend its own. For Bumpy Johnson, survival meant watching every move, never relaxing, and always remembering that silence could be shattered in an instant. On the streets of Harlem, power was never just about who had the most muscle or the biggest gun. The real calculation looked more like a chess match than a fist fight. What Bumpy Johnson set in motion was a kind of street-level deterrence, an understanding that any attempt to topple him would come at a cost no one wanted to pay. In the language of strategy, it was mutually assured destruction, but played out with ledgers and whispers instead of missiles. Intelligence, knowing who was loyal, who might turn, where the next move would land, became the shield that brute force could never match. Johnson's network didn't just gather information, it made every block in Harlem a potential alarm bell. The Italians could threaten, but they could never be sure what would happen if they crossed the line. That uncertainty was its own kind of weapon. The lesson outlasted the men who played the game. In every high-stakes negotiation, in every modern boardroom or backroom, the principle holds. True power isn't about domination, but about making sure your opponent knows the risks of making a move. Harlem's story is a reminder that sometimes the smartest play is to make sure the other side can't afford to win. In the absence of clear records, legends fill the void, shaping how power, loyalty, and community are understood far beyond Harlem. Today, stories of quiet defiance and calculated risk still echo in boardrooms and backrooms alike. Strategic restraint, not brute force, defines true influence. The silence that followed those 6 minutes reminds us, sometimes survival is the loudest statement of all. Share your thoughts below.